afternoon, everyone. My name is Ian Bailey. I am a weather observer and education specialist up here on the summit of Mount Washington. And today I'm going to talk to you guys about what it's like to live and work up here in such an extreme environment. And then a little later in the program, we're going to talk about the Alpine tundra and some of the different animals and plants that live up here, despite the harsh and awful conditions that we often see throughout the year. Before we get started, I wanted to show you guys what's going on up here at the summit of Mount Washington currently, so you can see what's going on outside. So I have pulled up here our deck camera. And it's been a pretty interesting day so far. We've kind of been going in and out of the clouds throughout the entire day. And so there are periods where we're completely socked in the fog and can only see about 100 feet or so in front of us. And then there are periods like right now where we're kind of in and out and we can see a pretty good distance away. So this camera is actually hosted inside of our weather tower, which looks down across our observation deck. And you can actually see the sun is peeking through and we can see some shadows moving across the deck. This big gray band here is a line of clouds that is moving pretty much right along summit level, right across the top. But you can see the mountains peeking out through the back. You can see how pretty much there's ice and snow everywhere, even up along our deck railing here. And it is a pretty cold and chilly day up here, despite going in and out of the fog. So to give you guys some numbers behind what's going on as well, wind speeds are just shy of 30 miles per hour right now, which is actually pretty low for our winter season. And we consider that fairly calm, all things considered. Our temperatures are sub-zero, and so we are just shy of 3 degrees below. So again, pretty chilly up here, especially when you add 30-mile-an-hour winds on top of that. We do experience wind chill factors, and while that's not a direct temperature that we measure, it is more of a sensation that the body feels. So when the wind whisks water away from your skin, it can make it feel much colder than it actually is, which is what we call wind chill in that sense. So with this temperature and wind speed profile, we're actually seeing wind chills of almost 30 degrees below. And so you can experience frostbite and hypothermia in conditions like that, which onset in only a matter of minutes if you're not going outside prepared. So we could see pretty far for just a few minutes before we kind of went back in there. So we could see about 60 miles away. That is still pretty good. And yeah, so again, we've just been in and out of the fog with chilly temperatures, moderate wind speeds throughout the day. And yeah, it has been a pretty interesting day so far for weather observation, going in and out. It makes it hard to see how far away we can see, what kind of cloud types are happening above us. So yeah, it's been pretty interesting. But I'm part of a crew of observers who have been up here pretty much since the 1930s, and our major responsibility is taking hourly weather observations and recording things like temperature, wind speed, cloud cover, visibility, things like that. And so that is our predominant responsibility. We're collecting all of that information and sending it off to the National Weather Service in Gray, Maine. You know, a lot of people assume that we actually work for the government. That is not the case. We're technically a private sector organization, and so we share that information with the National Weather Service so they can improve their forecast models and things like that. But we are a standalone organization funded through membership and fundraising efforts and things like that. So yeah, we're up here taking hourly observations. We also put out 2 forecasts a day. We put out one in the morning and then one around 5 o'clock in the evening as well. So we're doing forecasts. We do a lot of research work up here too. Our intern, Jay, who is currently on the summit with us, is looking at different pressure trends between the different sensors that we use to measure pressure up here. We look at snowpack and how long the snowfall lasts throughout the season up here. So we're doing lots of different things regarding research. And this is all happening inside the weather room. This is kind of our central hub where I'm coming to you live currently. And this can be a pretty busy room. You know, aside from all the science work that we do a lot of outreach as well. So we can communicate with local TV news stations, radio stations. We talk to the Weather Channel pretty frequently when things get crazier up here. And so, yeah, this is a pretty busy room. Hello to everybody who just chimed in. I'm glad you guys can make it. We're just getting started here, just talking about some of the different things we do up here on the summit. So this is a pretty busy room, but probably one of the most important things about this room is behind me. And so this is the weather wall. And on our weather wall, we actually have a lot of instruments that are recording to paper charts, similar to how we've been doing pretty much since the 1950s. You know, occasionally we do lose power up here, so a lot of the digital electronic instruments that we use to record things can fail and do lose their power source. But these guys operate on their own power source. So if the power does go out, which it does do frequently, or if something does break, these guys will continue to monitor weather observations, so we never lose track of what's going on. And because of that, we have such a huge climate history going back 86 years of weather observation, and I've never lost track of anything in that sense. So very, very important charts, and I want to talk about one of the most important charts on that wall, which is actually just above my shoulder here. This is our haze chart. Now, the haze chart is being it's recording from an instrument that's measuring the force of the wind on top of our tower. And it's a paper chart in a circle that actually rotates around over a period of 24 hours. And it has a red pen on it that is recording ink based on how much pressure is coming in from the force of the wind. So from the further away from the center, the red line is recording on that chart, the faster the wind speeds are. And it's kind of like measuring earthquakes in the sense that there is a back and forth wiggle on the line. And the bigger the back and forth wiggle in that sense, the stronger the gust is. Now, this is a decent haze chart. We've had moderate wind speed throughout the day. But overall, for the last week that we've been up here, the wind speeds actually have been really calm. But 2 Mondays ago now, there was a really powerful wind event up here. Then we have saved the haze chart from that. So I kind of want to show you guys a couple more of the impressive haze charts that we do collect. One from the summer and one from the winter, so you can see what a really impressive chart looks like. So I'll start with the summer one first. And generally speaking, during our summer months, things are a lot more calm. You know, the atmosphere actually expands as a result of warmer temperatures, so there's a lot more room for pressure systems and air masses to move through. So generally speaking, we don't see the crazy wind events that we do like we see during our winter season. But that doesn't mean that we don't see crazy wind events at all. So there's this guy right here. So this, let me back it up a little bit. There we go. So this was from the summer of 1996, where we recorded wind speeds sustained or continuous at 134 miles per hour and gusting up to 154 miles per hour. So that's pretty crazy for the summer season. Again, the further away from the center you are, the faster the wind speeds, and the bigger the back and forth wiggle, the stronger the gust is. So this was a really impressive summer event for us, and you can see on the left side of the chart, the pen almost went off the page. You know, the haze chart's really only calibrated to measure winds up to 140 miles per hour sustained. We'll talk about what happens when we go higher than that in just a moment. So that's our summer chart. Let me show you the winter one, the one that we just recorded, not this past Monday, but the Monday before. Now, during our winter season, it's kind of the opposite effect. So the atmosphere cools and there's compression. So there's a lot less room for systems to move through. And generally speaking, we see a lot higher wind events on average. Every 3 to 4 days, we go above 100 miles per hour. And in this case, we definitely went much, much higher than that. So check this guy out. So this was from last Monday. We had gusts up to 171 miles per hour, and it was sustained at 148. So continuous 148 mile per hour winds, which is pretty crazy in that sense. And the pen did, in fact, go off the side of the chart here. There was no way that we were going to stay on the chart in this case. So what do? You know, how do you make sure you don't lose track of that record? Well, just above the haze chart is another one called the Barton chart. And the Barton chart is set up and does the exact same way, as the haze chart does. But it's calibrated for much higher wind speeds, all the way up to 285 miles per hour, which is really high. At this point, I want to ask you guys a question. We had a previous world record wind speed up here, and I'm wondering if anybody knows or wants to take a guess at how fast the winds are for our previous world record wind. So what do you guys think? If you know the answer, put it in there, or shout out a guess. Let's see what you guys think. So go ahead and post in chat. Let's see what kind of answers we get here, knowing that the Barton chart is calibrated to 285. Okay, 230, good. What else we got? Any other guesses? 272, okay. And 270, all right. So yeah, I see some more guesses coming in. The correct answer is 231 miles per hour, which is really, really fast. And that actually occurred in 1934. So we'd only been up here for 2 years on the summit at that point. And we were definitely not in this building. This building wasn't built until 1980. The building they recorded that wind speed in was very similar to a log cabin, like a wooden shack in that case, that was held down by heavy metal chains right here at the very top of the auto road. So if you think about it, being in the 1930s in Category 5, much higher actually than Category 5 hurricane force winds on top of Mount Washington in a wooden shack. We do have the record book from that day, and the comment section is pretty interesting. You know, the people who were up here on the summit to measure that were pretty spooked, but also pretty excited at the same time. And so we noticed that we had really crazy wind events like that one, and we had repeated high wind events after that. So in the 1950s, they designed the haze chart and then consequently the Barton chart to make sure that we never lose track of that record. And so those two guys, very, very important charts for us to have up here on our weather wall, and paper charts, so again, we never lose track of the record that we're keeping. So at this point, I'm going to switch over to a presentation. I want to show you guys what it looks like during some of the seasons up here, some of the different instrumentation. We'll talk about Marty, who is our resident cat up here, and then we'll transition into the Alpine Zone and some of the different plants and animals that we see up here. So let's go ahead and dive right in. And on this picture, this is very similar to what it looks like outside right now. Pretty much everything up here is covered in ice and snow. in the heart of our winter season. Now, generally our winter season runs from the middle of October all the way into the middle of May. So for the predominant part of the year, for about 8 months out of the year, we're sitting up here below freezing with tons of ice and snow. The summit building is actually right up here, and you can follow the auto road a little bit down off the top of the mountain. This is absolutely close to the public during the winter season because it's usually buried underneath about 20 to 30 feet of snow. And so, yeah, not a whole lot of people are coming up here during the winter, and it's a significant portion of the year that we're essentially buried in all of the ice and snow up here. Now, we do run trips to the summit. We do have a snowcat which can actually plow its way across the snow all the way the 8 miles up to the summit, and this is what you see when you get to the top. So this is the Sherman Adams building, owned by New Hampshire State Parks, where people come and visit when it actually is open to the public during the summer months. And we lease this part of the building right over here. So this is the Weather Observatory. This is our weather tower. You can see a couple of the instruments up here housed at the very top, and then the station is actually down here. And if you're looking in this window right now, you would see me talking to you. So this is what it looks like when you're coming up the road in the heart of this winter season. It's just impressive how much everything is covered really in ice and snow. Now, we do have a summer season, and we will definitely circle back around to a picture like this when we talk about the Alpine Zone, and we do thaw out. It's only for a few months, about 2 to 3 months between June and September, but we do have a really lively ecosystem up here. So once you get off the rock pile up here and down below, you get into some grasses and some smaller sedge. A little bit further down is where the Alpine Garden is. We'll talk about some of the different plants and flowers that are in bloom in that Alpine Garden, and lots of different kind of animals up here as well. We have mice, flying squirrels, red fox and snowshoes hares, raccoons and weasels and things like that. So it is, in fact, a very lively ecosystem once we do thaw out of the snow and get into the heart of our summer months. Now, we do have transitional seasons too, which only really last for a few weeks, what you would basically call spring and fall. And during that period, we actually see some really interesting things going on with clouds. So generally speaking, when you're outside on like a gray, gloomy day, maybe it's raining, the sky overhead is completely covered in gray, you would call that overcast. Now, occasionally, that cloud level will form really, really close to the ground, sometimes below the level of the summit. So for our purposes, we'll go outside for our observation, and we'll just look out into this vast sea of white clouds, and sometimes it's in a full 360-degree circle. For our purposes, we call this undercast because it's in fact forming below us. And this is one of the cooler things to see up here. I really love seeing a good amount of undercast because it's kind of like the Obs. It's its own little island in a sea of white clouds. It really is kind of fascinating to see. And generally speaking, we have cloudy or foggy conditions up here for about 60% of the year. So for the other 30 to 40%, we do have some really impressive clear days too, like this guy. Now, it gets incredibly clear up here, especially during the winter, because a lot of the dust and particulates and haze actually is forced into the lower part of the atmosphere through that compression. And so when we look out from the top, we actually don't have to worry about looking through dust and haze. And on our best days, we can see about 130 miles away. So we're looking off to the north here in this picture. If you were to shift over and look off to the west on a 130 day, you could see clear across the state of Vermont all the way to Mount Whiteface in New York, which you could see across an entire state. That's really awesome. If you go the opposite direction and look off to the east over this way, you could actually see the ocean in that case. And it happens more often than not. The problem is when you're looking off there and you're trying to see the ocean, you don't see it terribly often because it actually blends in with the horizon. The only time that you're really going to see the ocean is if you get up early enough and go out on the deck for sunrise, or if you see it on a really clear moonlit night, you can see the light actually reflecting off the ocean, and it really is beautiful. So when we do clear out, we can see some really fantastic stuff, and we can see really, really far away from up here on the top. And so while we are home to the world's worst weather, we are home to some of the most beautiful weather as well. And it is a nice change of pace when we do get those clear days. Now I'm going to switch gears and talk a little bit about instrumentation. In particular, this guy. This is the instrument that's actually recording to the haze chart on the weather wall here. So this is our pedostatic anemometer. And it might look familiar from the front of an aircraft. They actually use these pitot tubes to measure how fast the aircraft is moving through the air. So we saw that technology and said, hey, we see some pretty crazy wind speeds too. Why don't we modify that for our own purposes? And that's exactly what we did. We built this pitot tube in-house, and we're using it to measure the force of the wind. And as far as I'm aware, we're the only observatory on the planet that makes use of that technology. So how does it work? Well, it's got a vane on the back that points the tube into the direction where the wind is coming from. And on the front of the tube, if you can see, there is a small hole. Now what will happen is the wind will blow on that hole and create a difference in pressure between the inside of the tube and the outside of the tube. And we can use that difference in pressure, essentially that force of the wind, to get a wind speed. And so we actually calculate displacement of inches of water on this chart right here on the weather wall behind me to get wind speed in that sense. And so it really is awesome that we can do that and that we were able to build that technology in-house for our purposes. And the pitot tube is great. It's incredibly sturdy, so it can withstand the ice and the wind and the crazy conditions really well. And through this coil, we can actually heat it to 300 degrees Fahrenheit, which is really great for helping with the icy conditions and things like that that we have to deal with more often than not. But the problem is it is very heavy. And because it's heavy, it doesn't actually rotate into the lower wind speeds very well. So for that, we have this anemometer here. This is our R.M. Young propeller-based anemometer. It has a propeller on the front that spins faster and faster as the wind blows harder on the front. So this guy is great at picking up wind speeds less than 20 miles per hour, can actually detect wind less than 1 mile per hour like we had the other day. And so this guy is super important when we have calm conditions up here on the summit. It doesn't happen terribly often, but when it does, we need to make sure we're not losing track of that record. So we'll put the R.M. Young up alongside the pitot tube to make sure we don't miss those really low wind speeds. But the problem with the R.M. Young is that it freezes over really, really easy. It has a lot of moving parts, and we can't heat it to 300 degrees like we can the pitot tube. So it'll actually accrue a lot of ice and can actually freeze and lock into place. And if we're not careful, it can actually get destroyed, which is very expensive, as you might imagine. And so when we're noticing conditions getting into the freezing sector, when wind speeds are like 30 to 40 miles or more, then we're going to take the R.M. Young down, bring it inside, and just let the pitot tube do its job up there. That way, the instrument doesn't get destroyed, and we're making sure that everything is going smoothly up here in regards to measuring the wind speed. Now, I've mentioned the ice a few times so far, and I want to take a second to talk about a particular set of ice that forms up here that we see really, really often and is something that we have to deal with really frequently. So I mentioned that we're in the clouds for about 60% of the year, and so oftentimes we're sitting inside of a fog bank. And inside of the fog, there are millions and millions of tiny little water droplets. Now, I mentioned earlier as well that a lot of the dust and particulates are forced away from the summit, and so those little water droplets don't have anything to latch onto and freeze and turn into snow when we drop below freezing temperatures. So what you get then, in a sense, is all of these water droplets that are actually below freezing, but still in liquid form, and we actually call that supercooled water. Now, what will happen then is that supercooled water will get blown around by the wind, and as soon as it comes into contact with the surface, it freezes instantaneously, just like that. And what will happen then is that freezing process will happen over and over on every surface up here, and the ice will in fact start to grow. And it will actually grow backwards into the direction where the wind is coming from and form what we call rime ice. And rime ice is fascinating in the sense that it grows everywhere. It can grow in lots of different shapes and sizes and at different rates as well. So this is our summit sign. It's about 2 feet long. You can see in this picture there's about 2 to 2.5 feet of ice that built off the side, growing backwards again into the direction where the wind is coming from. Now, it's not always that big in the case. Sometimes it can be really small and kind of poofy as well. When you have light moisture content or you don't really have very strong winds, you can get these little puffs of ice that grow everywhere on the summit. Sometimes they take this kind of icy feather-like structure, which is my personal favorite. Sometimes they can grow massively long, so there's like 5 feet or more off the side of the railing, depending on what's going on. It oftentimes grows off the ground, kind of like these icy road spikes. It makes it look like you're walking around on a different planet up here. And if you're not careful, it can even grow on you too. So when we go outside to take these observations manually, you're outside anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes, seeing what's going on with the weather. And if you're out there long enough, you can see, ice will grow pretty much on the side that you have facing into the wind. So like on this observer, it's on their back and shoulders and on the back of their legs, things like that. So you got to be careful even on yourself when you go outside. But primarily what we're concerned with is when it grows on the instrumentation. So actually underneath this giant chunk of rime ice here, there is a wind vane that we use as kind of a backup to determining wind direction. Over here, this is where the pitot tube is. And again, even though we heat this thing, and can heat it to 300 degrees, ice still grows up the side of the tube, which presents a really big problem. So part of our job is to go outside with crowbars and heavy mallets and things like that, and we have to knock the ice off the instrumentation to make sure that it's still reading accurately. And sometimes we have to do that on the order of every 15 minutes, and that's regardless of what's happening outside. This could be 120-mile-an-hour winds, middle of the night, ice and snow, things like that. And so I have a video that I actually want to show you guys so you can see what that process looks like and how exciting as it is to have to go up there and to deal with that. So let's watch this video. So we try not to do this alone. We try to go up as a team We actually can't use harnesses or straps to hold us against the tower because those straps can snap in the wind and become very dangerous. And so we use our sheer strength to hold us against the side of the tower while the other observers are down on the parapet to catch the person if they get blown off. So you kind of lock yourself into place, and then you take your crowbar, and you never hit the instrument directly. You hit the post that it's attached to, and you're trying to create vibrations to shake the ice loose, and then the wind will blow the ice off the rest of the way. So he's locked into place. He's going to take a couple of good whacks at it. And see, now the pitot tube can actually rotate in the wind now that there's not as much ice holding it in place. So this is a very important job for us to handle. And again, it is very exciting, especially when you're going up there in 120, 130 mile an hour winds. And it's something that we really need to stay on top of to make sure that we're keeping our accurate wind record as we go forward. So it is a bit dangerous and a bit exciting, but you know, that's part of the job, and that's part of living and working up here for sure. There we go. Okay, sorry, I lost my presentation for a moment. Okay, so I'm going to shift gears one more time in this sense, and let's talk about this little guy right here. This is Marty the cat. He actually lives up here on the summit with us year round. And the observatory actually has a really long history of having cats up here, pretty much since we've been up here. If you look at a picture of our original founding fathers, the guy on the right, on the far end there, is actually holding a cat in his arms. It's a black cat, so it's hard to see in that old picture. Very similar to Marty in that sense, but we have had cats up here, and we do so for a couple of reasons. It's really nice to have a little companion with us hanging out here on the summit, especially during the winter season when it is closed to the public. We don't see a lot of people. It can get kind of lonely up here, especially for the night observer who's staying up all night taking the observations and doesn't really have anyone to talk to. So the companionship really is super important in that sense. And also, these guys are hunters, so they have free range of the building and pretty much the summit. They can go anywhere they want, and they actually stay on top of the mice and the flying squirrel problem. They oftentimes get into the building and get into our food. So instead of us having to deal with it, these cats have a pretty good history of hunting down and dealing with that issue for us. So it really is fantastic that we can have something up here to handle that. That's also basically a pet. And I come from a home where I have 5 pets myself, so it certainly helps me feel a lot more comfortable up here, especially during the winter season. And so Marty obviously isn't indigenous to the summit. We brought him up here just like we brought all the other cats up here. But there are plenty of animals and plenty of plants too that actually do call the Alpine Zone the summit home. And so I want to spend some time talking to you guys about the Alpine Zone and some of the different environments up here, and then some of the different plants and animals and what they've done and how they've evolved over time to adapt to the life up here on the mountain in the harsh and the cold and things like that. And so that's where we're going to go. And I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but if you guys have questions, please feel free to ask. I'll try to answer them as we go through, and I'll also take some time at the end to answer questions as well. So don't be shy. If you have questions, feel free to ask them, and I will try to get to them by the end of the presentation. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the different types of environments up here, and then some of the different plants and animals that we see as well, other than Marty, at least in this case. So when you start off at the base of Mount Washington, you're essentially in what we call a deciduous forest, which is very similar to pretty much any forest that you've probably been in before. Lots of maple trees and beech trees, your general walk in the woods kind of forest, as you will. Lots of very tall trees in this case with big green leaves, lots of big bushes and things like that. That is very much what the base of the mountain is like, pretty much all the way up to about 2,000 feet. When you start to get to the middle parts of the mountain, you actually enter what we call the boreal forest, and that's a lot more evergreen trees and things like that, a lot of pine and spruce and fir trees and things like that. These trees are much better at handling the cold conditions up here, not so much the wind, but they're way better at handling the cold conditions through their needles and things like that. So when you're about halfway up the mountain, you're seeing a lot of these kind of pine trees and things like that, and less of the maple trees and big leafy trees that you see down towards the base. Now, once you're through the middle part and basically up to about 4,500 feet, that's when you officially enter the alpine tundra. The alpine tundra is vastly different from the 2 environments that you saw before, in that you don't have any tall trees or tall bushes. They absolutely cannot handle the extreme elevation and the extreme elements that we see up here. It's far too cold and too windy for those kind of things to exist. Now, these alpine zones pretty much exist all over the world. You'll find more and more of them as you get closer to the poles, north or south, whatever direction you go, and at higher elevations as well. Now, as we start to experience the effects of climate change and as the planet starts to get warmer, some of these alpine tundras will retreat, or some of them might even disappear. So they're becoming more and more rare. But we do have one right here in New England. And so it really is kind of fascinating to see how the different, plants and animals learn to survive in these conditions. The alpine tundra is really kind of a rough place to live. When you get to the brass tacks of it, we see sub-freezing temperatures for so long, 100+ mile-an-hour winds. The soil up here is incredibly loose and dry. There are tons of rocks and boulders everywhere. And so the conditions are really not favorable for most of the plants and animals that you would expect. So it's very, very harsh. The high wind actually makes blowing snow kind of like a sandblasting effect. And so it really damages a lot of the trees and more delicate plants, so they can't survive. A lot of animals will actually retreat off the mountain because they can't handle the conditions up here. So it still is really rough, but there are some really hardy species up here that have learned to adapt and survive, especially plants. And plants in particular have done a lot as far as evolution is concerned in order to handle these conditions. So obviously everything you see in this picture that looks like a plant is low to the ground. So you don't see any large trees, you don't see any large bushes. Everything is very, very close to the ground here, which really helps in the sense of, dodging the high wind, or at least suffering less effects from the high wind. Everything is also really compact too, and that compaction allows them to trap heat really, really well. So they can actually stay warmer despite the freezing cold temperatures. Now you can't see it, it's actually below ground. They have really impressive root systems as well, sometimes on the order of several feet long. And this allows them to get a really firm grasp on the mountain, so they don't get blown off the side, and they can take in way more water and nutrients in that sense, and have those and survive on those a lot longer, particularly through the winter season itself. So they have those adaptive roots, and a lot of the plants have these really tiny, narrow leaves that are very flexible in the wind, unlikely to get blown off. And sometimes they're waxy too, and that waxiness is super important because it kind of acts like an insulating layer and traps water in. We talked about wind chill earlier in the sense that wind will whisk water away from you. This waxy coating on a lot of the leaves up here traps that water in and allows the plant to survive on that for a lot longer. So they've developed that over time so they can continuously drink and have the nutrients necessary to survive up here. So let's talk about some more of the plants that you see in this picture, and what are some of the plants that live up here in the Alpine Zone throughout the year. So we'll start with these guys. These are arguably the biggest and most impressive ones. We call these Krummholz, or the crooked wood, as you were. These are basically your trees, quote unquote trees up here. They're not terribly tall, sometimes only a foot or two taller than the average person, but they have these impressively thick and powerful trunks down at the base. They're almost like concrete, like reinforced concrete. Very, very tough and very durable and very big, so that they can store a ton of water, whatever water that's available to take up here through the rocks and the dirt that they're latching themselves onto. So they grow close to the ground. They're only, a few feet tall in that sense, lots of water available to them. And they have this gnarled look as a result of the wind. So you'll notice on this tree, and if you look into the background here, these trees as well, they only have one side of the tree that has branches on it. The other side is completely bare. As you might guess, this is the side that faces into the wind. So any of the branches and leaves that grow on this side would just get blown off. So instead, what the tree does is focuses on growing them on the other side, on the downwind side of the plant. So they have a lot better chance of surviving the higher winds. And because of that, oftentimes Krummholz is called the flag tree, as it were, because it does in fact look like a flag. You got your flagpole here, and then the branches off to the side that essentially look like the flag in that sense. And so they get this gnarled, kind of bare on one side, lush on the other look, based on the wind. And they're also super old too. Some of the Krummholz that we've seen up here is 150 years older or more. So they've been around a lot longer than we have for sure. It's definitely their home and their space. And they typically hang out down near the tree line, and they're not terribly high up in that sense. You can get up to about 4,000, 5,000 feet before they kind of stop. But they are some of the oldest organisms that are up here on the summit for sure. So this is our tree. Pretty much most of the plants that you see after this point are going to be very, very small, very close to the ground. So let's take a look at some of those. So this is Alpine Azalea, very, very small shrub that grows these kind of pink looking, like crown-like flowers on them that are protected by these kind of blade-like green, thick leaves, which kind of act like as a shield to buffer some of the wind, while at the same time taking in a ton of moisture and a ton of nutrients and accelerating the photosynthesis process. So these leaves are essential for this plant to survive the harsher conditions up here. So they can grow and anchor to these rocks, as you can see in the picture. So they do grow from the soil, but oftentimes they can lash themselves onto the rocks as well, which makes it a really, really durable anchor for them. So they're less likely to get blown around by the wind. And because of how compact they are, they have this like kind of cushion shape to them. They're actually able to retain a lot of the heat. Similarly, like how I mentioned before, this helps them kind of survive the cold conditions not well enough where that these guys are a perennial plant, but they do last for a significant portion of the year into some of the winter season because of the way that they can trap heat and because of how their leaves store nutrients. So that's one of the plants that we see up here. This is probably one of the more famous ones. This is called Diapensia. Diapensia is very similar to Alpine Azalea, but it's kind of taken those evolutionary processes that have made it more comfortable up here in the Alpine Zone and enhanced them in a sense. So they too are very pincushiony. They grow very close to the ground. This is as tall as the flower gets. This is it just before it blooms, and this is when it's reaches maturity, and you can see how very small, how very compact and tight everything is in here. So it's a very small little flower. This guy is perennial, so it can last the entire year, and oftentimes will exist just beneath a layer of snow in different sections of the mountain, and so it will last throughout the year because it does a fantastic job at trapping heat, way better than the Alpine Azalea does. But the problem with that is when we get into the summer season, because of how much heat it takes in and traps in, when we get warmer temperatures up here, like in the 60s and low 70s, when we're approaching the max temp that we've ever seen, these plants can overheat, and it will actually cause them to wilt a little bit and suffer. So they don't do so great when it gets really hot outside, but the flip side of that is they do fantastically well in the colder temperatures. So they are very much designed for the freezing conditions that we see out here throughout the year. So very, very great for that. They too have very thick, kind of like paddle-like leaves, so very, not as much blade or shield-like with the Alpine Azalea, but these paddles take in a ton of sunlight and can help, store a lot in the way of food and moisture and things like that. And so these guys, these plants actually very much act like kind of like a camel. They store their nutrients and their water source so they can last through the winter season without having to worry about taking in nutrients while they're buried underneath all that snow. And one of the most fascinating things about this plant is that it actually pollinates twice. And so there's a pollination at the beginning of the summer, generally between May and June, where it blasts its pollen into the air and it's blown around by the wind, seeds as well. And so it disperses Diapensia across the top of the Alpine Zone. It does so again about a month later, July into August, so that it can actually make sure that it actually spread its seed and pollen effectively. So just in case things didn't go well the first time around, this plant will be like, all right, let's do it a second time just to be doubly sure that we're going through pollination and seeding properly. And it's, as far as I'm aware, the only plant that does that up here. And so it's doubly sure that it's spreading its seed and getting things taken care of before it gets into the winter season. So Diapensia really fascinating in that sense as far as how it spreads across the top of the mountain. Now, another plant that we see up here is lichen. Actually, I like this picture because it shows you most of everything we've talked about so far. So you've got your Krumholtz here and your Alpine Azalea and Diapensia. And then if you see these little spots on some of the rocks, this is the lichen that I'm referring to at this point. So lichen is actually a fungus that has algae inside. They kind of have a symbiotic relationship where they rely on each other, and that the algae will bring in nutrients through photosynthesis and things like that, and the fungus will actually suck up nutrients from the soil and the rock that it's attached to. And lichen pretty much grows everywhere. It's surmised that about 6% of the planet actually is covered in lichen, and it is a very, very hardy plant. They did a study where they launched lichen into space and exposed it to the vacuum of space for about 15 days before bringing it back down, and the plant lived, believe it or not. It can actually enter this kind of like hibernative state where it basically dies, but then once it's in more stable conditions, it releases its nutrients and its water and kind of brings itself back to life, which is really crazy. So a very, very hardy plant, perfect for surviving the conditions up here. Stores plenty of water and nutrients. And again, it's very, very hardy, and it's a great food source for pretty much everything up here. Some of us have even eaten lichen before. It's not terribly tasty, but because it's so packed full of nutrients, it is a really decent food source. So yeah, all of these plants are consistent. All of these plants are actually found in our alpine garden, which looks very similar to this when we're getting into the summer months. When it goes fully into bloom, it looks a lot prettier. And so tons of people actually come up here to visit the alpine garden because they can see all the beautiful plants that they weren't expecting up here at this elevation, and some of the rarest plants that you can see in the entire state. And this is pretty much the last point for plants like this. Once you get above that, once you're getting up on your way to the summit, you can see you don't really see the flowers anymore. It's pretty much lichen, small grasses, and sedge from the alpine garden pretty much all the way up to the summit. So that's what's going on in the way of plants. Again, they've done a ton to modify themselves to be able to handle the harsh conditions up here, but the animals have done so too. Now, to a little bit of a lesser extent, a lot of the animals will actually go to lower elevations when we get into the heart of the winter season, but some of them do stay up here and have evolved ways to be able to handle the tough situations up here through camouflage, through burrowing, different ways of sensing, movement or how to navigate into the harsh, dark conditions that we awfully have. And so I want to show you a couple of those animals so you can see some of the different inhabitants that we have up here other than ourselves and Marty. So let's take a look at the first one here. These are the masters of camouflage. They are the snowshoe hare. And again, these guys are fascinating in the sense that during the spring and summer months, their coat is more of a dark brown. And so it helps them blend in with the rocks and the ground around. And then when we get into the winter season, they actually change their fur color to white. So they are more camouflaged with the ice and snow up here. Now these guys are burrowers and they'll build their dens amidst the rocks and down in the soil. And so they do a really great job at staying out of the elements in that sense and staying away from predators. Obviously they have this great camouflage, and their diet pretty much consists of all the small plants that we talked about, the berries that they produce, and things like that. And so these guys really, really great at staying out of danger. They're incredible jumpers and climbers. When we were coming up on one shift change, we actually saw one kind of leaping up the rocks. This was back in November, so as we were getting into the winter season. And they're very great at just bounding and leaping from boulder to boulder and then just kind of landing right in their burrow and going back to safety. So fantastic climbers, great at camouflage, really easy diet with plenty of food up here, and they're burrowers too, so they can stay below the snow and stay safe. So they do fantastically well up here in the Alpine Zone. Similar things seen with the red-tailed fox, so this is more of the predator side in this case. Red-tailed fox also make their dens amongst the rocks as well, and they are burrowers in that sense, but they're not tunneling under the snow or the ground unless they have to. So they can make their den amongst the rocks. These guys are a little bit more likely to migrate down when the conditions get too harsh, but they can stay up here for a decent chunk of the winter season, and they do really well up here. They are omnivores, and so they will eat plants and berries, and then they also will eat small mammals too, and the snowshoe hare if they can get their hands on them. So they have a wider dietary sense, but what makes these guys so special are their ears. So you see these giant ears on the top of their heads here. They have fantastic hearing for low frequencies. So what will happen is the fox will kind of bounce around on the snow and ice and rocks, and the entire time they're listening, and they can actually pick up the sound of small animals burrowing under the snow or down into the dirt and the rocks. And so they'll listen for that sound, and they'll kind of bound, and then pounce on where they think the source of the sound is coming from, burying their face into the snow and ice. And if they find what they're looking for in that sense, then they will pick up the small rodent, and they'll be on their merry way. So they have this excellent hearing source, which makes it really great for them to find food when it gets really kind of icy and snowy up here. And so they do a really good job at hunting in that sense, and so they can survive up here a lot longer than most other creatures. Now I want to get into some of the flying ones because they have the special advantage of, well, flying. So this guy right here, this is the raven, and these guys are very, very common up here. Huge, massive wingspan, very sharp beaks so they can actually penetrate down into the dirt and some of the rocks so they can get at bugs and berries and things like that. They're fantastic flyers and gliders, so they'll actually ride the thermals up from lower elevations. They'll fly and coast right up to the summit. They'll hang out, look for rodents and things like that are insects that are moving down near the ground or flying just below them, and they'll swoop down and grab them. So they're fantastic hunters and great flyers in that sense. With the added advantage of height, they can move really, really well. So they can get off the mountain if they need to, but they do a lot of their hunting up here. Now these guys are also incredibly intelligent as well, believe it or not. Some ravens actually have the ability to recognize faces on people. If they keep encountering the same person over and over, they actually will become familiar with that. And they're incredibly confident too. And so they can recognize when they're in danger or when they're not very easily. In some instances, you can even pet one if it feels comfortable near you. So they're very, very smart. And so they can use that intelligence for pretty much everything they do, from hunting to eating to flying, things like that. Very, very smart creatures. And then lastly, we have these guys, not a bird, but still a flyer in that sense. These are flying squirrels, and not flying in the sense they're actually really fantastic at gliding. They have pockets that go from basically under their arms to back where their legs are. And in that sense, they can coast very, very, very well on the thermals. And so they too will ride the thermals up to the summit. They'll coast down to the rocks or to the observation deck or inside of our building, as it were. And they will hunt for berries and seeds and small insects and things like that. But what's most interesting about flying squirrels is that they can actually glow. Believe it or not, they can glow fluorescent pink. And there's a lot of speculation as to why they do this, so we're not entirely sure why they decide to glow the way they do. But we do have reason to believe that they use it as a communication and signal source. And since they see pretty much through UV light, they use it to help navigate in the dark and navigate in the snow and wintry conditions up here. And so they glow, which is probably the coolest thing ever. And it's very, really helpful for them in that sense that they can communicate with other flying squirrels what's going on, and it does help them see. So it's really clear in that sense, between the plants and the animals that live up here, there's a lot of adaptation necessary to live in the harsh conditions. But these, different species do fantastically well. And while we're up here working with the crazy weather and enjoying the experience from the atmosphere, there's plenty of amazing and interesting things to see just in the Alpine Zone, in the place where we live, and incredible things to experience and learn about the different animals and plants that live up here. So I've basically reached the end of my talk at this point. So I'm going to go back through the chat and see if you guys have any questions that I can answer, and feel free to ask more. I believe we have a couple minutes left before I have to go outside and make sure we get the ob. So let's take a look and see what kind of questions you guys have. So, do we stay overnight, and how do we get to work? So yes, we do stay overnight. We actually stay up here for 7 days at a time. From Wednesday to Wednesday, we live and work up here on the summit. And we get up here during the summer months. We take vans and trucks and we just drive up the auto road. During the winter, we take a machine called the Snowcat, which is very similar to the machines that you see grooming the side of ski resorts. So we basically plow our way on top of the snow that's on top of the auto road all the way up to the summit. And during the summer, that process, getting from the base to the top can take about 45 minutes or so. During the winter, it takes anywhere from 1 to 3 hours, depending on what the conditions are. So yeah, I mean, it's a bit different between summer and winter, but we do manage to get up here, and we stay here for 7 days at a time. So let's see. What else we got? Oh, I see that my audio was breaking up. I apologize for that. Sometimes the internet likes to get a little wonky on us, but hopefully it wasn't too bad. Does Marty come from a shelter? I believe he does. Yeah, and it's actually interesting how we decided to bring Marty up. He actually came up during a presidential election, and so we decided it was apropos for us to have our own election to see what cat was going to come up next. So he was actually one of 3 cats that were part of this election, where we did, an observer vote on which cat, was favored amongst the observers, and then we did a popular vote. And Marty won the popular vote by a landslide, and so he was elected to come up here to be the new summit cat, which is kind of cool when you think about it. Do foxes have any natural enemies? I'm sure they do, especially with some of the larger creatures. Not that I'm overly familiar with, because most of those creatures actually hang out in the lower elevations, which is another reason why the red-tailed fox likes it so much up here. They're very comfortable up here in the Alpine Zone. They don't have to worry about as much. There was a period of time where a red-tailed fox would actually come up here to the summit, sit on one of the rocks, and watch sunrise. Now, unfortunately, they haven't done that in a while, and so it's a shame, because I really hope that I could see that in my time up here. But yeah, they are very comfortable once they're up here in the Alpine Zone. Do bears or bigger animals ever come up to the top in nicer weather? As far as I'm aware, no. They are much more comfortable down at the lower elevations, and it takes them a long time to kind of move around. In my time, I haven't seen a bear up here, and I haven't heard of them. I've seen them a lot more down in the valley. There was one time where a moose actually came up here, but we have reason to believe that it had some kind of sickness or illness or like a brain infection, where it came up here to the top, on our observation deck, and actually jumped off over the side and died. And so, bigger animals really don't do well up here. They're not really built for the conditions up here. And only really come up here if there's something wrong with them. So yeah, we don't really see a whole lot of the bigger animals up here for sure. All right, I think I've reached most of the questions here. And so if you guys have any other questions, feel free to reach out to us on Facebook or Twitter. You can also email me at ibailey, so that's IBAILEY, at mountwashington.org. I'm always happy to answer any questions you guys might have. And I really appreciate you guys tuning in with me today to talk about this really awesome place. So thank you so much. Hopefully you guys enjoyed, and I will see you around.